In this first episode of Inspiring Psychologists, Breaking the Mold of Private Practice, I explore the idea that private practice is not just an end goal, but a continuous journey of growth, change, and self-discovery. Join me, Wendy Kendall, as I discuss what I see as the core principles and values guiding mental health professionals, embracing change within practice, and the importance of community throughout this path. Learn how inspiring practices are redefining the landscape of private practice and how you too can break the mold by embracing the journey. I'm Wendy Kendall, and I'm here with you in this episode to talk about the journey of being in private practice and about what it means to embrace the whole journey, how inspiring practitioners are redefining the path of private practice. So what I realized as I was thinking about how to raise these conversations about the path of private practice was that I really wanted to offer a counterbalance to some of the narratives of private practice that are based on 10 timesing your income or focusing on the end goal of having some kind of practice that was, perceived as successful by people around. Now, it's not to say that we don't want to be successful, but really what I've seen more and more and what I've experienced more and more as a psychologist in private practice is that it's by paying attention to the path that we're traveling that we actually end up in a place that feels more meaningful and purposeful. And along with that comes a lot more of the, let's say, the external trappings of success. So as opposed to getting really caught up in the comparisons that we end up caught up, with, I wanted to share with you in this episode, but also in the discussions with other psychologists and therapists who are also walking on this path. And I think it's a really important story to tell about private practice, that private practice is also about the whole journey, meaning it's not just about the successes. It's not only about, the number of followers on social media, for example. Having a meaningful and purposeful and impactful private practice that supports you in the life that you want to live means embracing the wholeness of the journey. I know that a lot of psychologists and a lot of therapists come into private practice because they're actually looking for something deeper in their professional life. It's not always about a promise of, as I said, some kind of external trapping of success. Also, a lot of these practitioners, the more that they tread this path, the more they tread this journey, they realize that there are conversations that we need to have about private practice, about the way that we show up as psychologists and therapists, the way that we are working with communities and with individuals to create change, to have a positive impact on the mental health landscape. There are conversations that we need to have that go against the grain of what it means to be a psychologist. And in that sense, that's why I really want to talk about the stories that are about breaking out of the mold of how private practice has always been done. So, starting with this story, and I work a lot with stories when I'm working with people in private practice. And what I've observed is, why do people come into private practice? For sure, there are definitely some people that know that private practice is for them. And they have really felt that in their bones, even through their training, even whilst they may have been in either public or private sector jobs. But they know that private practice is going to be part of their journey as a professional. At the same time, it's not uncommon that comes with guilt. This idea that, especially within the UK, for example, and within the UK public sector, a lot of my clinical and counselling colleagues may go into private practice and they know it's really for them, but there's an element of guilt in leaving behind their colleagues that are currently in the National Health Service, for example. There are also a lot of stories of psychologists and therapists coming into private practice because they're escaping toxic environments in some way. And, that might be directly because they've experienced bullying in the workplace, for example. Or it can also, it can be because the environments that they're working with are actually exploitative. And they are what I call extractive models of doing business. So if you've ever worked in an environment where, you're working long hours, your needs aren't being accounted for, you're experiencing burnout, maybe you have punitive kind of managerial relationships. So a lot of people actually come to private practice because they fundamentally want to feel safe in their working lives. I know that part of my own story was some of that as well, creating an environment for myself, having come out of UK public sector, where it was going to feel safer for me to work as a psychologist. I definitely had some of those toxic experiences working in UK public sector before I went into private practice. I think there are also people who come into private practice because they go through a big life transition or they're facing a big life transition. And as part of that story, there are also people who come into their private practice and almost immediately, without having recognized this is what was going to happen, they also go through a big life transition, not just associated with the private practice itself, but it's almost like the conditions that were leading to this big life transition actually indicated to them that perhaps private practice was going to be the way to go. And something about that shift gave them enough space to then negotiate a big life transition as well. So in that sense, I really see the start of a story there that is about how important private practice can be to the very human and transformational journeys that people go through as psychologists and therapists. Along with any of those stories, inevitably are periods of disillusionment. And so this whole topic of experiencing disillusionment on the path is something that I work with my colleagues, in the support that we offer to psychologists and therapists. Often people come to us with some form of disillusionment, either with the profession, with their experience of private practice, or with their experience of life and where they're at the time. One of the things that really seems to underpin this sense of disillusionment, and it can be really interesting to try and track this down in ourselves, is that psychology as a profession makes us somehow and in different ways, makes us exile parts of ourselves. So in order to be acceptable, in order to be successful, in order to show up in a certain way, we need to jettison or move to the edge of our psyches some really important parts of ourselves. And I know when perhaps at the start of a career, or maybe when you're a little bit younger, that feels like we take that as part of the thing that we need to do, right? And it's as we get older, we realize those parts of ourselves that we've exiled actually were really important to who we are And now we're feeling a disconnect between the path we're on as a professional, especially when we're working with people, organizations, families, where we ourselves are, proponents of wholeness. And so we start to realize that we're not always walking our own talk. So I think, that is a really, when I realized that was a fundamental part of my own journey, and when I saw that so many times in the clients that I have worked with, it made me realize what an important part of this journey the disillusionment on the path is. Also, one of the areas that can lead to disillusionment on the path is that we learn extractive or exploitative ways of being in our practice. And so when we look at, some of the business models, for example, that we grow up within, some of them that we're socialized within, we might be socialized in those toxic environments. And that's the way we know how to go about our business, driving ourselves really hard, working all the hours, putting ourselves in overdrive, seconding our needs in order to prioritize other people's needs. And those are all ways in which we get exploited as human beings and as psychologists. And we can end up replicating those because we don't necessarily know a different way of doing and being in our private practices. So starting to become aware of the difference between an extractive or an exploitative way of being in our practice, and starting to move towards more what I call regenerative or life-giving models and ways of being in a private practice, is some of the most fundamental, transformative and inspiring work that we can do as practitioners. So I think, relearning and reconfiguring and therefore breaking out of the mold of private practice is so important for how we develop the future of this profession. I think a third way in which there is disillusionment on the path is because sometimes we've come out of toxic environments. It can lead to us imagining that isolation in our private practice feels safe. We feel empowered again. We know that we are the ones that can make decisions about how we show up. And so that in itself, that isolation can feel very empowering. We get to choose. We decide what we work on. We decide when we work. But the reality is, at some point, we need to come back into community. I think it's a little bit kind of mirroring the process of therapy when we've had those experiences of injuries to our, relational injuries. Then, first of all, maybe working with an individual feels a little bit safer. But at the end of the day, can we reintegrate into a community of practitioners? Always being on our own, always being isolated leads to loneliness, and it leads to us feeling drained. I put my hands up. I've been there and I've done that. I can really speak to, this experience in the muscle. I know that perhaps, I think it was about for the first 7 or 8 years of my private practice, and I've been in private practice for 20 years. I remember having this very dichotomous experience between getting on an aeroplane and going working with clients and being with lots of people. And then I would come back to my office and I would be completely alone. I'd drop the children off at school and I would be back there and I would spend 8, 9, 10 hours completely on my own. So it becomes draining. You can do that for a while, but after years, it becomes really draining. We need safe community. We need a place where we can be ourselves in relation to other people and other practitioners. So all of this to say, I feel like private practice is always the path itself. That's the thing that I've learned that feels most important to really start sharing with people. In that way, I'd like to give a couple of examples of private practice as the path itself. Now, I'm going to share a couple of example stories here with you, but these are archetypal stories. So these are stories that are kind of composites of people that I've worked with. I never feel comfortable sharing stories that aren't mine. So if, whenever I'm asked about, well, what did you do with your clients? Can you tell us stories about your clients? And I'm like, well, I could do, but it would only be my interpretation of it. And I don't know what my clients think about me either sharing their story or, the things I'm going to miss out of their story. So these are some archetypal composites that I'd like to share with you. The first is about Dr. Emily Thompson, and she's a clinical psychologist who's always been passionate about art therapy. Before starting her own practice, Emily worked in a traditional therapy setting, but it left her feeling creatively stifled, and that ultimately led to what I call this disillusionment on the path. She believed in the transformative power of artistic expression. She'd experienced that herself, and she believed in its ability to help clients explore their emotions and heal. Emily decided to create a private practice that specializes in art therapy for children, adolescents, and adults dealing with trauma. Her practice, Artful Healing, offers individual and group sessions, workshops, and training for other mental health professionals interested in incorporating art therapy into their practices. The experiences of Emily, though, were that she initially faced skepticism from her peers who questioned the effectiveness of art therapy. And she also struggled to find a suitable space for her practice. She had to invest in renovations to create an inspiring and nurturing environment for her clients. Also, Emily had to educate her community about the benefits of art therapy and its evidence-based results. And so when you're walking a story like this, you can see how these pathways also bring up a lot of our inner wounds around being seen and being good enough. And so self-doubt creeps in. When Emily was able to join a community of inspiring practitioners, she was able to connect with like-minded professionals who were also on a similar pathway. And they supported her vision and provided valuable advice on overcoming obstacles, both the external obstacles and the internal obstacles. And, sure, networks can help her refine her marketing strategies, but they can also help to strengthen her to advocate for art therapy more effectively. And ultimately, that leads to building a thriving practice that helps clients tap into the healing potential of art while spreading awareness of the benefits. So that's an example of a kind of archetypal practice story that I work with, where someone really believes, that there are other parts of them that really connect with the transformative power of art. And that means, but they're thinking about, how am I going to bring that in? What does that look like? How am I going to convince people? Where am I going to get investment from for that? How am I going to get people to believe in me enough so that they invest in me when I'm still trying to, provide the evidence-based or provide the evidence-based research that I, feel should be out there. The important element of these stories, though, is that all of those experiences are necessary for an inspiring practice. Not only the success, not only the getting of the investment, but also the experience of the criticism, also the experience of feeling exiled, also the experience of welcoming back the parts of you that mean so much to you but didn't have a place in your professional life to this point. So as we look forward to the rest of the episodes in this series, I'm going to be inviting other practitioners who I know have trod along this path, and they're going to share their stories in their words. And that's why I felt like a podcast was a great option. I want to hear from other practitioners about their experiences on this path, and I want to hear all of the experiences, because all of those experiences are absolutely crucial to helping us to break out of the mold of how private practice has always been done. In any hero story or any heroine story, there are always tormentors on the path. And I use this word tormentors because I trained as an internal family systems therapist. And I don't offer therapy, but I use IFS in my coaching work with practitioners. And the originator of IFS, Dick Schwartz, has this word that he uses about, the people or even the inner parts of us that show up along the path that are kind of the villains of the story. All good stories have villains, right? And so I really want to speak to the tormentors. Now Dick talks about tormentors as in mentors, because they're always there to teach us something. And I think it's true, and it's also painful. Just because we've reframed it doesn't mean that experiencing tormentors on the path isn't painful to us. So I'm going to speak to a couple of common tormentors on the path. The first common tormentor is the critic. And I would really like to emphasize that those critics are sometimes real external critics, and sometimes they're very real internal critics as well. So, the tormentors are not just internal, they're also external. They definitely show up out there. The other tormentors that I've come across regularly, internal and external, are the imposters. And there are definitely internal feelings of imposters, like I'm going to get found out, I'm going to be seen to not be as good as I think I am, or even just generally, the internal imposter experience of saying, I really want to do this thing, but when I look at the other people that are out there that are doing this work, the work that they're doing is just so amazing, and I couldn't even compete with that, so why would I even start? I definitely have conversations with practitioners where that internal voice is a common accompaniment to them being on this path of private practice. And speaking to the existence of external imposters as well, one of the experiences that isn't often talked about, but that is often experienced, is that of professional plagiarism. So I know from experience that there are, whether it's content, whether it's copy, whether it's webinars, whether it's positioning of certain products, that whenever I put my best work out there are places it starts to show up on the internet, and consistently as well. And in addition to that, interestingly, nowadays, you might think, well, where do all these ideas come from? But nowadays, of course, our websites and our sales pages show us who is coming to the webinars, who is clicking on the links, who is revisiting several times, many times. And so we see those traces of the professional plagiarism as well. Whenever I've spoken of this topic, these external imposters that show up on the path that are also really hard to deal with and yet can be really helpful in our journey because they push us to let go of the things that we might otherwise hold on to. They push us to keep traveling further and further into our individual journey of wholeness. You know, we can't stay with our own cliches when we have external imposters who are hoovering them up and kind of reflecting them back to us. Means we have to keep growing, we have to keep innovating, we have to we have to continue to grow as individuals as well. So nevertheless, when you're on that path and you meet those kinds of internal and external tormentors, it's really hard to deal with all of them when we're on our own. Just being on our own is it's a very hard place to be when we come across those kinds of internal and external tormentors. And that's where I wanted to turn to another story that I like to talk about in private practice, which is how creating an inspiring private practice is like being in the Fellowship of the Ring. Now, it's like being in one of these stories. It's really important to us to have a fellowship of like-minded individuals, a fellowship of people who have also experienced the trials and the tribulations, who've also encountered the tormentors on the path. These fellows can help you to see the way even when all feels lost. If we think about some of those archetypal stories where you've had, that band of people around you, when the heroes experience those dark nights of the soul and those those deeply tormenting experiences, they need to have their fellowship around them to help them see the way back into the path. In the same way, when we become a part of a fellowship like that, we realize that it's so important for us to be a guide on a path and to not always position ourselves as a guru. So there's a whole podcast that I did on this with my colleague, Michaela Thomas, a couple of years ago, where I talked about this experience myself of realizing that I wasn't there for practitioners to be some kind of guru, that it was important to be a guide, to have made the mistakes, to have experienced those things, to have those kind of human frailties and vulnerabilities. And going further than that, realizing that actually in our practices, if we're really going to put down the role of being a guru, if we're really going to take ourselves out of our ivory towers, if we're going to break out of the mold, what that also means is being with and being led by our clients and our colleagues. And so that's really where we're embracing what it means to be part of a whole community. In that way, what I've also discovered is a kind of paradox with all that, which is the more we tread this path, the more we embrace the wholeness of it, the more that we bring parts of ourselves out of exile and bring them back into our practice as professionals, the more that private practice is a path to being more of who we are. Interestingly, the more we become unique within the market. And recently we participated in a mastermind program with Carol Sanford, who speaks a lot to principles of regeneration in business, in life, with families, in leadership. And one of the really important principles that Carol spoke to when it comes to being more whole, being more of ourselves in our private practice, is the principle of non-displaceability. So as opposed to trying to create competitive advantage, which inevitably leads us to these much more extractive models, can we do more for less? Can we get more out of people? We're playing a different game. It's a different path. We're walking a path to non-displaceability in the market. We're showing up as our whole and entirely unique selves, and we're building a connection with a community of people who resonate with that. That can't be copied. And also for our inner imposters, well, there's no imposter in that either. So all this is really, sharing with you some of my thoughts about what led to my own kind of journey, embracing this whole journey, which can be thrilling, which can be inspiring, which can be challenging, which can lead to dark nights of the soul as well. I didn't start my private practice on purpose. I was someone who, if you'd asked me while I was in my public sector job about starting my own business, I would have been like, no way. But it was a big life transition, and it was also part of escaping a toxic environment where I just said I would start my private practice, and that's what I would do. But I really wandered, WA. I wandered in the wilderness for years with it. I did a lot of work as an associate. I got into kind of professional relationships that just weren't nourishing. And I really experienced a lot of dark nights of the soul with that. What I realize now is that I was a participant observer in my own process. So as with a lot of these journeys, it's not always that, when we're going through that we realize what an essential part of the journey it is. Similarly, I know that, when I first developed my first development program for psychologists in private practice, which was called the Psychology Practice Accelerator, very quickly, think about the 3 people who joined that initial program. What I really learned from them was that private practice was about the personal growth journey, and that was going to be central to the rest of this story. And finally, thinking about where the business is at now with Inspiring Psychology Practices and the inspiringpsych.com website, that was really born in the crucible of 2020 with the various lockdowns, where, in my corporate practice, where I'd been supporting companies to move people around the world, suddenly all the borders were shut and there was a lot of uncertainty. But at the same time, in this business, there was an enormous move for psychologists to go online. And I think the whole experience with various lockdowns, with the pandemic and so on, really caused a lot of psychologists and therapists to really think about how did they want their practice to be in the future. And so that leads me to, the end of this part of the story. The people in the podcast episodes that follow are my fellow travelers. Some of them I know really well. Others I know less well, but I still know some of their story. But what I would say is, just to really kind of round this off, is if you resonate with any of this story around embracing the whole journey of private practice and walking on this path, make sure to follow us, make sure to subscribe to, wherever you get your podcasts, but also reach out and get in touch if you also have a story to share. And we'd love to hear about it. That's all for now. See you in the next episode. I'd love to hear what you think about the Inspiring Psychologists podcast. So please take a moment to leave a review and give us a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes a massive difference in helping us to reach new audiences. If, like me, you're feeling inspired and moved by the private practice stories in our podcasts, please spread the word across your own networks. And why not encourage your colleagues and friends to listen to the podcast too? To make sure you don't miss out on future episodes, please be sure to subscribe to the Inspiring Psychologists Podcast. You can find out more about all my guests from Series 1 at our website, inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com.